Sunday morning on Max Yasgur's farm. You are standing in mud to your ankles. A stranger you have never met is handing you a paper cup of granola. The ticket in your breast pocket has been wet for 2 days, and you are not going anywhere. This is South Coast Hat. How you got here, and why you are still here, takes a little explaining. Rewind to Thursday night. There is a car, a road atlas, a ticket in an envelope that arrived in the mail 3 weeks ago, carried flat and careful ever since. $18, advance purchase, transferred every morning from yesterday's jacket to today's. It is August 1969. You are 19, maybe 20, old enough for the draft, not yet drafted. That distinction mattered enormously that summer, because the lottery hadn't been held yet. It wouldn't come until December 1st. Every young man driving toward Bethel, New York, carried that uncertainty, the way you carry a sound you can't locate. Present, low, unignorable. Your mother stood at the door Thursday evening. She looked at you the way she does when she knows something is going sideways and loves you too much to say it plainly. Sunday night, she said, you promise. You promised. Your father leaned out from the hallway, arms crossed, more amused than alarmed. You paid $18 for a ticket to a farm. You didn't have a good answer. You got in the car. The air through the window was warm and kind of thick. Summer, or anticipation, or the particular feeling of August 1969. When the country felt kind of coiled and waiting, and the only place that promised something different was a 600-acre dairy farm in Sullivan County, New York. But the roads into Bethel were already backed up for more than 20 miles, and you still had no idea that the ticket in your breast pocket had already stopped being a ticket. Route 17B came to a standstill Friday morning, not a slowdown, a wall. More than 400,000 people were trying to reach a festival designed for 50,000 down 5 narrow roads at the same time. The New York Daily News reported delays of up to 8 hours for a trip of less than 100 miles. People simply stopped their cars and got out. You locked yours. You checked the ticket was still in your pocket. You started walking. Around you, as far as you could see, thousands of other people were doing the same. Sleeping bags, blankets, acoustic guitars, someone's dog. The road had become a kind of river flowing in one direction. That's when a man leaned out the window of a car that wasn't going anywhere. He was in his 40s, local, not a festival goer. You could tell by something settled in his posture. He watched the stream of people walking past. Then he looked at you specifically. You're not going to be the same person coming back, he said. You didn't know what to do with that. You filed it somewhere. You kept walking. By mid-afternoon Friday, the fences around Max Yasgur's farm had been overwhelmed. The crowd that materialized in Bethel was, by some estimates, the 4th largest population center in New York State. The ticket booths, the entry gates, the fence lines, designed for a concert. What arrived was a temporary city. Organizers made the only call that made sense. They opened the gates. Free. You reached the gate and touched your breast pocket. The ticket was still there. It just wasn't a ticket anymore. You didn't take it out. You didn't throw it away. You walked through. The contract had dissolved. You just didn't know yet what had replaced it. From the stage that evening, Arlo Guthrie leaned into the microphone. The New York State Thruway is closed, man. The crowd responded with something between cheering and stunned recognition. The Thruway itself wasn't fully shut. Police had closed at least one exit, but the essential point was accurate. A performer was now delivering traffic reports. The state's infrastructure was bending around this crowd. There was no map for what it had become. The first rain came Friday night around 10:30 p.m. Joan Baez was on stage. She finished her set in a downpour. You were in the field. The grass went slick. Your jacket was soaked within minutes. By Saturday night, the electrical grounding, not designed for sustained rain, began to fail. The sound engineer on site said it plainly afterward. The electrical grounding hadn't been thought through to the point of what happens if it rains. The answer was that it sparked. The official food vendors had run out of supplies the very first night. By Saturday, you were eating peanut butter without bread. The promise to your mother was already kind of impossible, and you knew it, and the knowing sat somewhere in your chest, alongside the wet ticket and the stranger's sentence and the thing you were still waiting for that you hadn't named. And here is the thing you would have to explain to anyone who wasn't there. You were not waiting for the music anymore. You were waiting for something you couldn't name yet. The ticket in your pocket couldn't tell you what it was. And your mother, 100 miles away, waiting for a phone call that hadn't come, couldn't tell you either. By Sunday morning, the farm had become a sea of mud. An attendee named Nancy Eisenstein described it later. It was a quagmire. It sucked your shoes off. It was not only mud, but cow manure, and it was so dark it looked like chocolate syrup. At least 2 people had died at Woodstock by this point. A 17-year-old from Newark named Raymond Misak, run over by a farm tractor while sleeping in his sleeping bag, and 1 additional death from an overdose. Farm machinery was still moving through the grounds. There were also at least 2 births, one after a helicopter evacuation, one reportedly in a car outside. Woodstock was kind of doing everything a city does, just without any of the infrastructure a city requires. Then something happened on the main stage. A man named Hugh Romney, most people knew him as Wavy Gravy, leaned into the microphone. "What we have in mind," he said, "is breakfast in bed for 400,000. The hog farm commune had been running a free kitchen since the vendors failed. Rolled oats, bulgur wheat, seeds, honey, driven to Manhattan and back, made in massive batches, handed out in paper Dixie cups at dawn. Between 15,000 and 20,000 servings every morning. A stranger turned around and held one out. You took it. You stood in the mud in what had once been a ticketed, fenced, commercially organized concert, eating granola from a paper cup handed to you by someone whose name you would never know, and you understood that this was the thing. Not the performers, not the lineup, this. A crowd of 400,000 people, most of them draft age, most of them underfed and sleeping on a dairy farm in the rain, choosing, without enforcement, without authority, to take care of each other. In August 1969, 1 year after Chicago, 4 months before a lottery would determine whether the young men in this field would live or die in Southeast Asia. No intercrowd violence had been reported. None. 0. The country had spent a decade deciding this generation was selfish and dangerous. This was the answer. You didn't have words for it yet, but you held the cup. At 4:30 Sunday afternoon, the thunderstorm arrived. 1 inch of rain in 2 hours. The stage went silent. The bowl became a lake. Everything before this had happened when conditions were merely terrible. This was when conditions were actively hostile. People put their arms around strangers. The crowd stayed. You stayed. You pulled the ticket from your breast pocket. It was barely recognizable, a soft, pulpy square of what had once been cardboard and ink. The name Woodstock was still visible faintly. You tucked it back in. By Monday morning, the crowd had thinned from 400,000 to roughly 25,000. Jimi Hendrix took the stage at 9 a.m. in the sun. The people who saw him close the festival were not the ones with the best tickets. They were the ones who had stayed through all of it. The walk back to the car was the same road in reverse. You found it where you'd left it. You got in. There had been a payphone somewhere outside the grounds. You had waited more than 2 hours to use it because everyone wanted to say the same thing. You won't believe what is happening here. When you finally reached the front, you called home. It rang. No one answered. You didn't try again. The words you were going to say were still somewhere in your chest. You'd find them eventually. Maybe on the drive home. Maybe not until you pulled up to the house and she came to the door. You started the engine. And then the man from the traffic jam came back to you, leaning out his window on Route 17B, Friday morning, the whole standstill behind him, just a man watching a generation walk past towards something he couldn't follow. You're not going to be the same person coming back. You hadn't understood it then. You understand it now. You pulled out of the mud and onto the road, and the sun was out, and the ticket was still in your pocket, and you drove home.